Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing, brought to you by the Small Business Association of Michigan. I'm Brian Calley. I have the privilege of leading this fine organization.
Hi, everyone. Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Welcome to today's show. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our sponsor, SBAM Energy Solutions, your one-stop shop for small business energy efficiency solutions. You can learn more at sbam.org/energy. So, Brian, let's kick off today's show with a pretty critical topic. SBAM actually issued an action alert on this very issue this morning. The U.S. Department of Labor has proposed new rules that could have a huge impact on independent contractors.
Yeah, I mean, this is really big. This is one of the issues that's big enough for small businesses where, as we advocate on behalf and for small businesses, it's one of these like drop everything and really focus on this. So if you are an independent contractor as a small business, or your small business uses independent contractors, people that you pay with 1099s in the 1099 system, then you really need to pay attention to this part. There is a proposed new rule. So that's first thing, proposed. It's not the rule yet. It has to go. There's a rulemaking process, but it's a proposed new rule that would significantly narrow the circumstances under which an independent contractor or a person that you use to carry out aspects of your business could be considered an independent contractor. But instead, this new rule would reclassify many people that are currently operating as independent contractors as employees, which means that you are doing withholding and all the different things that come along with having formal employees on the payroll. So what's really driving this, the political issue that's driving it, is that for a long time in the world between the fight between business and unions over the years, independent contractors have been one of those sore spots. And so unions have really been leaning hard on the Biden administration to narrow the rules in which a business can use independent contractors and instead require those businesses to just hire people as employees instead. And obviously this presents a lot of big problems. That a lot of small businesses start as independent contractors and work on with 1099s or are paid in ways that are in the 1099 world, and so it ends up really hurting the way that some small businesses get started, but also many small businesses, as you're growing, of course, you don't necessarily need a full person for a certain type of work. Using contract employment makes sense in so many cases, or sometimes employees just want so much more flexibility, and that's what they want to do is to be less part of your organization, instead work on their own terms, separate, setting their own hours, setting their own work schedule, and the terms under which they work. So this could be very, very disruptive. But what makes it worse than what is clearly intended, so to eliminate independent contractors is what the intention is here. But it's also problematic in that it takes bright line standards or very easily understandable objective standards for when a person qualifies as an independent contractor and replaces them with very subjective or kind of squishy, blurry line type standards that won't be easy just to determine exactly whether or not a person does qualify as an independent contractor or if they have to be reclassified. So I wanted to just do kind of a rundown of some of the big issues and what they're trying to move to. First, they want to move away from the current standards that were put in place under the Trump administration, and instead go back to an economic reality test. And this is an old term; it's been around for a long time. But the Obama administration, that Department of Labor, had this economic reality test in place, and it was a series of tests. And what the Biden administration is trying to sell now is that they're just going back to the way the Obama administration did it. Even though they're borrowing the same term, the conditions that you have to meet to qualify as an independent contractor are more stringent. they're narrowed, but also much more subjective. It's so difficult to nail down exactly what they're trying to get at. And so part of it, one of them that I thought is particularly problematic is that there's a test of economic dependence. Is this person economically dependent on the business that they're contracting with? Well, I mean, all small businesses are economically dependent on their customers who pay them for their goods or services. Like this economic dependence test is one that is it's really like how much dependence is required. It's just one of these tests where it's clear it's a person in the government who is trying to narrow it, but has never run a business. They identify certain like core factors, if you will, the opportunity for profit loss depending on managerial skill. So this one, like, can this person, based on their managerial skill, make more or less money? Well, I mean, how much more subjective can you get than that? But that would be one of the tests. If a person really is kind of working in a rigid type of a system and their managerial skill is irrelevant, then and under my reading of this proposed rule, they would have to be considered an employee. An investment by the worker and employer, did the worker make any investment in capital that is entrepreneurial in nature? So it's not just an investment in capital, but investment that is entrepreneurial in nature. What could they be talking about with this? I think it's pretty clear that what they're talking about are things like DoorDash and Uber, where somebody's bringing their car to the table, right? So Uber doesn't own the car, DoorDash doesn't own the car. The individual contractor is the one who owns the car. So under current standards, it's obvious that's an independent contractor. Under these new standards, you're saying, wait, but was the purchase of that car entrepreneurial in nature, or would they have purchased the car anyway? In other words, the fact that it's a personal use car that is also used for business somehow means that now they're no longer a contractor. They have to be classified as an employee. And to illustrate how silly that is, imagine that if I was going to do carpentry work and I've got a hammer at home, I use the hammer for personal use. I also use the same hammer to do contract work for somebody else. Is the fact that that hammer is used for personal plus contract work somehow make it less of a contract relationship? These are the types of changes. If there's a degree of permanence to the work relationship, in other words, if it's a permanent, like an ongoing relationship, long-term relationship, that counts against you, therefore you're an employee. Well, what small business doesn't want a long-term relationship with their customers? It defies logic to go to these types of systems. And at what point does that become a permanent relationship and therefore doesn't qualify as a contractor anymore? There are more. I'm just giving you a little bit of a taste of the standards or the rules they lay out and what they're trying to use to narrow in. The problem is there's big penalties for non-compliance. They call it payroll fraud if you have somebody misclassified. So the idea that they go from a bright line standard to a subjective standard, and they go from one where there's like a safe harbor and meet these criteria, and that person is can be classified as a contractor, and they have to be an employee, to something that has a lot more gray area. It's a threat to Michigan's small business. Well, small business around the whole country, because this is a U.S. Department of Labor change. One other thing, they do what the Department of Labor, the story that they're trying to sell here is that, number one, they're just going back to the Obama era rule. They use some of the same phrases, but I want to be clear that this is much more restrictive than that rule. But by using this economic reality test, what they're saying is that they're aligning with Supreme Court precedents. They say we're better aligning with Supreme Court precedents. And what they mean by that is that they're going right up to the line of what a 1949 Supreme Court decision would allow the government to get away with in terms of their restriction on the use of independent contractors. So they're saying that they're aligning with precedent as though that's what they're supposed to be doing. But what's really happening here is the Supreme Court drew a line. They've made that line fuzzier with subjective standards, and they're saying they want to go right up to the edge of the line and do the maximum amount of restriction and limitation that they believe the Supreme Court decision would allow. And so that's why I take issue with this characterization as though they're aligning with the Supreme Court. They're not. All they're doing is taking maximum advantage of the most restrictions they could put in place, and arguably still do it legally in a way that would pass a legal challenge. So this is the first step. What we have a call to action because it's not open for public comment yet in the Department of Labor. We'd like for our members of Congress to hear from us straight away, from small businesses straight away. Ask the Department of Labor to withdraw this proposed rule and go back to the drawing board on it. So we have a call to action. I think it's been dropped in the notes here. Please, if you haven't done that yet, even if you're not an independent contractor and you don't use independent contractors, this is such an important part of the small business ecosystem. You've heard politicians all, the last couple of years have been bragging about this explosion in new business starts, and there's been a lot of them here in Michigan, but most of them start out as independent contractors. And so we can't celebrate the start of all these independent contractors and then narrow the circumstances where they could get work and be their own bosses out there in their place in the economy. So please do participate in this call to action. The more that responses that we get, the better. The more our members of Congress and our senators hear from small business owners, the better. We will have another call to action that'll come along in about a month when they open the official public comment period with the Department of Labor. And we'll push hard on that one too, that we just want thousands of comments in there and asking them to scrap this proposed standard, go back to the standard that was previously in place that they just rescinded, go back to that standard. And to the extent they want to make changes, they need to be bright line standards, and standards do not diminish or restrict the ability of people to start new businesses as independent contractors, or for small businesses to utilize independent contractors where it makes sense to them.
And yeah, we did put the action alert link in the comments on both Zoom and Facebook. I think it's a pretty easy tool to use. You just have to enter in your name, your address, and I think your phone number too. They require that for these federal seats. And there's a populated email in there, so you can sign your name to it, and it'll be off to our senators and to your local congressperson. So thank you for doing that. And feel free to share that link as well. If you have others who might be inclined to support this, send it their way as well. So Brian, let's talk about inflation. You teased out on Monday's show that a new report would be out. Is it out, and how does the number look?
Unfortunately, it's worse than expected. So it was not expected to be good, and it came in higher. Inflation came in higher than estimates. So if you look at overall or headline inflation at 8.2%, it was expected to be 8.1%. It may not sound like a big deal, but it's just the idea that expectations are kind of like priced into the stock market, or priced into the way that decisions are going to be made. And when it looks like it's going down and it turns out it's not, then that has a pretty big impact overall on the future policy decisions. What was more troubling to me, though, was that there was a bigger increase in what's called core inflation. So you got the commodities that move very quickly up and down, but then you have core inflation, which are goods and services that are purchased that are not commodities. And those actually went up higher than expected as well. Overall, core CPI, core inflation was 6.6% overall. Headline inflation was 8.2%. Remember, you make about 8.3% of your income every month. So that's like a month's worth of income that has been stolen from inflation. And so it's a big deal. If you look at the items in the last month, gasoline had been going down. 18.2% up now for last month. Fuel oil was up 58.1%. A few of the other big movers, airline fares up 43%, and then milk up 15.5%, eggs 30%. So these big moves that have been happening. Unfortunately, they're persisting. These year over year and month over month increases, both coming in higher than what we would want to see, given the aggressive action that the Federal Reserve has been taking. The fact that this is up higher than normal, I mean, it locks in that, this range of possibilities with the Federal Reserve in terms of future increases. We know that they're going to do at least 2 more, maybe 3 more. Would they be, 0.5% or 75 basis points? Would they do a full percentage increase in any of these? When a report like this comes in, it means that they're going to be more aggressive. So probably 3 more increases, probably, 75 basis points or a full percentage increase in any given move, as opposed to the smaller increases that would be more typical of what you'd see in the past. One other item, earnings numbers came out earlier this week, and then you've got inflation, and so they do this calculation, real average hourly earnings increase or decrease. So it's earnings increase minus inflation, and it's -3%. So even though there have been increases in wages, inflation has eaten that up and then some. And unfortunately, inflation has exceeded wage growth for about 1.5 years now. So if it seems like there's kind of a sour mood out there, it's, I think there is a frustration that even in the face of wage increases, that people have less disposable income because inflation is stealing away their buying power.
All right, let's move on to the topic of prevailing wage. A judge recently sided with the state of Michigan in this case. Can you remind everyone what the prevailing wage case is and what might happen next?
First of all, prevailing wage is this idea that if you're going to bid on a government job, you have to pay union prevailing wages as for any of the work that you do on that job. And there's a lot of private sector companies that are not unionized, especially smaller companies that don't tend to be unionized, feel like this really does kind of take them out of the mix. They could be competitive. They can go in this and get this work, and yet the government is kind of artificially diminishing their ability to get work in the government contracts. In 2018, Michigan's prevailing wage law was repealed, and it was done by Citizens Initiative. And so when that happened, it made it so, there's still a federal prevailing wage called Davis-Bacon. So road contracts, road construction, that's all still under the federal prevailing wage, but state contracts no longer required that. The Whitmer administration passed an administrative rule that added back in, so didn't change the law, but tried to do through administrative action prevailing wage to put that back into to some of the state contractual work. And there was a lawsuit that Associated Builders and Contractors that have brought to challenge that administrative rule, saying, hey, prevailing wage was already eliminated. You can't just bring it back by executive order. And so it's now in court. It went to the first step in court, which is the Court of Claims. This is the court of original jurisdiction for any lawsuit against the state. And it's Judge Shapiro is the judge. If he sounds familiar, it's because he's the one that also struck down the minimum wage and paid leave compromise of 2018. And that, so, definitely a left-leaning judge, and, this decision would also fit that pattern, but it will absolutely be appealed to the Court of Appeals. And it's another one where I just think that the executive action to try to overturn the law change that happened in 2018, I think the state has a pretty weak position when it comes to winning this case in the long term. So first round, though, at the Court of Claims, the state won against this challenge that would require prevailing wage in state contracts, essentially kind of resurrecting the law that was repealed in 2018.
All right, we are less than a month away from the general election. So we have a couple of different topics to cover here, but the first is an interview that Governor Whitmer recently gave. And in that interview, she kind of outlined several different topics, initiatives. Let's start with her priorities. What did she outline as her priorities?
Yeah, it was really interesting. A lot of times you get like an article that is written about an interview, but the Detroit News did an interview and they printed a transcript. It was really, I thought, quite interesting to see that, like, the full answers, much more informative than a summary or a synopsis of the answers. And so I assume they're going to do this with Challenger Tudor Dixon as well. And when they do, we'll cover that on this program too. The first, the kind of overarching, running for re-election, what are you trying to accomplish? The governor zeroed in on K-12 education and roads. Of course, roads was a big theme in 2018 in the campaign that brought her into the governor's office in the first place. So not surprising that there would be focus on that. It's one of those things, kind of it was a campaign issue back then. It'll continue to be a campaign issue moving forward. And then the K-12 system, of course, a lot of work, been a lot of headlines lately about how much kids have fallen behind coming out of the pandemic era, where there was a lot of remote learning or learning that didn't happen because of the remote situation. And so two areas where the governor kind of zeroed in terms of overarching priorities for moving forward.
And in our previous conversation, you referenced adopt and amend. Did she say anything about that case?
Yeah, it was interesting to see. So adopt and amend, this is about that, the compromise for prevailing wage and paid leave in 2018 that a judge struck down and put the previous regime in place, higher minimum wage, more paid leave requirements, especially on small businesses that weren't previously subject to this rule. And so when asked about that, the governor started out, the first sentence of her answer did acknowledge that businesses have been increasing wages. We've seen wages go up out of necessity to get workers. Of course, we like that idea. The market drove up wages. That's the right way, as opposed to government saying what they have to be. But she did kind of lay out several sentences about workers deserve, or full-time workers should be able to make a living and take care of themselves, and shouldn't work 40 hours and still be living in poverty, which of course, I think these are things that type of statements that everybody would agree to. But of course, a business owner listening would say, but there has to be a relationship between productivity of the employee and their output and what's getting paid. These are not things that can be totally separated. So she said that, but the bottom line was she was willing to work with businesses to make sure that we do this in a way, in other words, implement the court decision in a way, to implement it in a way that can be implemented by businesses. Well, and so I guess what I take away from that answer is that there's not really a negotiation to be had on how it's going to be, but maybe the method of getting there. Like right now, it would be a light switch. It's in court, it's tied up in court still. It'll be in court at least until February. But in February, let's say that the state, in this case, it would be the state would be losing. The state loses the previous prevailing wage proposal and paid leave proposal goes into effect. It would immediately increase minimum wages overnight to a level significantly higher than they are currently. And also with restaurants, especially, the whole tip system goes away, and it would be a monumental change overnight there. What I read into this answer, although not stated plainly, was that there would be a willingness to talk about maybe something like phasing it in, but not what the ultimate answer is. So just a little bit of insight. I hadn't really heard her talk about this issue in the past, and I thought it makes sense to share that with you. So maybe willing to negotiate on the how, but not the what. All that said, we are still determined to win in court and defend the compromise of 2018, which had very specific provisions to protect small businesses within the new regulations that went in effect in 18.
All right. What did she say about the economy?
Well, on the economic priorities that were laid out, it was really a message about the workforce. I thought the overall priority of the workforce, you talked about going pro and reconnect, both priorities that are shared with us. And also she threw in some concerns about population trends, another thing that you've heard us talk quite a bit about. So I thought because the framing of this answer was good. We've got workforce challenges. We need a bigger workforce, more participation in the workforce, our demographics, our overall population. We need that growing again, because it's just going to get harder and harder, at least for the next 10 years, for businesses to fill positions. And then the other under this kind of like economic priorities that were laid out in that question, the third item that she touched on was climate change, that dealing with climate change that she views as an economic part of the economic agenda. Not really any detail on what those climate change policies might be, but just that she views that as an economic issue. So overall, those economic priorities: workforce, population trend, and climate change. Obviously, on workforce is something you hear from us all the time, and really, I think is going to be one of the critical keys to success, is figuring out how to get the workforce participation rates up.
All right, and finally, anything about taxes?
The governor did say that she was in favor of some tax cuts, which kind of, when I kind of read a headline that suggested governor was going to seek in her second term tax cuts, but there are a lot of different ways to cut taxes. And so in terms of what she's looking at, pausing the sales tax on gasoline was one of the examples that she gave. So that would be more of a temporary tax cut. So not, that I've heard it's somewhat kind of gimmicky, like to pause that. I think the idea that we have two types of taxes on gasoline is problematic, by the way. The sales tax and the gas tax both apply. And yet a lot of it doesn't go toward roads. Also, she mentioned tripling the earned income tax, and this is a tax credit to people who are working, but are working at lower wages. This again is something that we've generally been supportive in the past. Tripling it wasn't something that we had necessarily signed up for any particular level, but the idea of higher rewards for people who go to work, even if they're lower skilled and can't command high wages. And then an elimination of taxes on retirement income was another one. So, there wasn't in the tax discussion, there wasn't anything particularly threatening or threatening at all to business, but also, our main business tax is the income tax, and so that would be a nice one to see, perhaps, especially as the state's revenue has climbed so much, to see maybe a willingness to roll that back some. But in terms of the priorities on taxes, really more focused on consumers than business. But the earned income tax credit, one that does align with our agenda.
All right, and there is a debate tonight at 7 p.m. How are the polls looking as we head into this debate tonight?
Yeah, we have seen we've seen kind of an increase, a little bit of a narrowing that has happened in some public polling that has come out. So some had showed like a wide gap, like 16, 17 points difference between Whitmer and Dixon. There have been some new polls that have showed as close as 6, but a new one out today that had it at 11. Previously, that particular pollster had it at 16-point margin. But one thing is pretty common is they all have Whitmer between 49 and 51, or most of them have her kind of right around that 50%, and then have Dixon anywhere from the high 30s to up to 45%. And so that's kind of the range that these polls are coming in at. I'm not surprised to see some tightening because there wasn't a lot of awareness of who Tudor Dixon was before because it didn't have enough money to be up on TV and to do the type of advertising that the governor's had, and plus being a sitting governor, you get a lot of airtime anyway. So you had a name ID differential, and that's kind of slowly being made up on the challenger side. And so you naturally are going to expect to see it tighten up a little bit. But heading into the debate, I think what you're going to see is a very aggressive Tudor Dixon, and because she just needs to make a move, she needs something of game changer here. And you'll probably see Whitmer, take fewer chances and just look to not, she's already leading. She just wants to not do anything to put that in jeopardy. So different strategies. You're going to see probably Dixon really want to make a move and therefore be aggressive, and Whitmer that, probably played a little more safe, at least if they fell back into conventional wisdom and how these things usually go.
All right, so before we let you all go today, I do want to let you know that we have a new resource. SBAM put together a voter guide, and this voter guide provides responses from the candidates for governor, for attorney general, and for secretary of state. So those are 3 races that the SBAM Small Biz PAC did not issue an endorsement in, but we did ask candidates directly various questions about small business issues. So I'm going to put the link here in the chat on Zoom, and we'll have it on Facebook too. There's 2 videos there, one from Governor Whitmer, one from Tudor Dixon, and then responses to questionnaires from all 6 of those candidates. So please go check it out as you're making your decisions over the next few weeks. I think that's all we have for you today. We'll be back here on Monday.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Monday.